get started really quickly. We will keep introductions short, and we want to focus this year more on giving speakers time to express themselves. Last couple of years, this is a dark topic. We had forgotten genocides for a couple of years. Now it's atrocities in women. And usually the weather, we really played sport. It was dark and overcast and cloudy and raining and thunder and everything. Unfortunately, this year we have gorgeous weather, but I guess we'll have to just roll with it. We'll start with Christina Kalasunas. Now, Christina is the Director of Planning at ICHRRF, and she's also the author of this book that we published this year through ICHRRF, The Exploitation of Children and Youth in America. So there's a book table right outside this room. Please go take a look at some of our publications, and this is one of them. Her topic today is the ethnic cleansing by the Danish government, forcing doctors to insert IUDs in Greenlandic women. This is something that just came out a couple of months ago, and I hate to say it, but it happened only because of US influence operations and to influence the Greenland public. Otherwise, the world might have just forgotten this very sordid episode. The Danish ethno-state doing this to basically what is a colony of Denmark. So we're starting with atrocities on women right here in the Western world, and then we'll move across the world, different parts, different cultures, and see whether things are different or the same, and whether culture has any role to play in it. So without further ado, let me just introduce Christina and hand over the podium. Christina Kalasunas is a licensed independent social worker with supervisory designation. She's a mental health therapist. She specializes in suicide prevention and healing trauma. She's served at the local, national levels on quality improvement and system redesign initiatives and presented on national education calls. Christina is a certified anti-oppression informed practitioner in her region and earned a diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace certificate from the University of South Florida. She's interacted with people from all walks of life, and she has a passion for diverse cultures and religions, and she upholds human rights and religious freedom and educates others about the benefits of building respectful, collaborative, diverse, and harmonious relationships. So I welcome Christina.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. When I was asked to speak on this topic, I realized that it was going to be a lesson in time management for me. So I'll have my timekeeper helping me with this. So also I'd like to say that I didn't know much about Greenland, and I didn't really know much about Denmark, so I felt like I needed a foundational history lesson, so I'm going to walk through that today, given that we have a public audience, and I think it'll be helpful to review some basic definitions for anyone who could be watching this later on our platforms. Next slide. So I'll move briefly through the history of Greenland. Something important to know, and why it might be helpful to know is with it being in the news. I was like, why is Greenland in the news? You never hear about Greenland. What's happening there? What makes this important? Greenland is Earth's largest island, and it is inside the Arctic Circle, geographically a part of North America, but politically tied to Europe. So that is interesting. According to the CIA's World Fact Book, it is rich in resources, to include natural resources, different fish, whales, seals, and minerals, in particular, rare earth minerals, resources vital to producing technology in the next half century. Interesting fact, they may be able to meet up to 1/4 of the global demand for rare earth resources in the next half century. In other words, it's about the money. Next slide. A little bit about the social and economic history. The Greenland was reached by Vikings in the 10th century, and Norse exploration with significant influence by Eric the Red. So he founded the first Norse settlements, and that opened doors for opportunity for trade and different agricultural practices. And then the Danish started really colonizing into more the 18th century. They were motivated by the positioning of Greenland, and as well as the rich resources. Also, the Lutherans were introduced by Danish missionaries, and so that remains the predominant religion of Greenlandic peoples today. Next slide. All right, and political history. Greenland became a recognized region in Denmark when the new constitution for Denmark was adopted in 1953. The people were hopeful that they would have social, political, and economic equality. Unfortunately, they were quickly faced with what they called the birthplace criteria. And this justified paying Greenlanders according to Greenlandic standards despite Danish officials stationed in Greenland being paid higher Danish salaries as opposed to being paid Greenlandic salaries. This fueled Greenlandic nationalism in the 60s, and they were able to have home-ruled and limited autonomy in 1979, and in November of 2008, more than 75% of Greenlanders voted for the right to secede entirely from the Danish kingdom through the Act on Greenland Self-Government. Today they are self-governing, and it is within the Kingdom of Denmark, and the inhabitants have full Danish citizenship. Next slide. A little bit about the culture here. Almost 90% of the population is of Inuit or Inuit European origin. There are two distinctive Inuit cultures separated by the coastlines. We have Inuit East Coast peoples and the West Coast counterparts. The East Coasts were isolated for more than 160 years longer than the West Coast. And Danish colonialism played a role in the reduction of Inuit customs and traditions. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. The Inuit have 7 different dialects closely related to 3 different languages spoken by different Alaskan tribes and the Chukotka. And in present day, the modern Inuit experience erosion of language, urbanization, and shrinking community. They face social and economic equality and are politically marginalized, and they're also experiencing climate change. And today they live in settlements and urban areas and primarily work in oil fields, mines, and in tourism. Next slide. The presenting problem. So we have Danish health authorities who systematically inserted intrauterine devices into thousands of Inuit women and girls in Greenland between 1960 and 1991. There's been increased awareness over this issue. It's called the Danish IUD campaign, or referred to as the spiral case in social media and mainstream media, due to Denmark's national broadcaster Danmarks Radio release of an investigative podcast series titled The Coil Campaign. And it archived public research, had subject matter expert interviews, and survivor testimonies. And this series primarily exposed the mindset and motivations of those who organized this campaign, gaining international media traction. It sparked political and legal advocacy and encouraged more survivor testimony. And the Danish launched their official investigation in 2023, and they just wrapped it up maybe a month ago. And it contributed to the full acknowledgement of this human rights atrocity. Next slide. And with with this, the forced contraception, centuries of Danish policies dehumanized Greenlanders and their families. Children were removed from their parents and given to foster families for re-education. And there were also controversial parenting competency tests. This resulted in forced separation of Greenlandic families. Girls as young as 12 were subjected to forced IUD or hormonal birth control injections. And they were not provided information about the procedures or informed consent. There was various adverse symptoms, pain, bleeding, infection, medical complications, and the shame, anger, and complex trauma associated with what they experienced. Some even experienced miscarriages due to complications from these procedures. Women were silenced for years, processing these traumas alone and experiencing self-blame for not understanding their rights, not knowing how to self-advocate, and experiencing internalized shame because of it. Next slide. So the overall impact and consequences of this is that initially, the Greenlandic people started experiencing improved living conditions, higher quality access to healthcare, and as a result, they started experiencing population growth in otherwise impoverished areas. And unfortunately, this triggered a public health policy agenda of limiting population growth through forced contraception. So in the news recently, PBS found that nearly 150 Inuit women sued Denmark and filed compensation claims against its health ministry last year, citing human rights violation. As many as 4,500 women and girls, approximately half the fertile women at the time in Greenland, experienced this between the 60s and 70s alone. Next slide. So, as Dr. Adityanji explained, it was important to understand who does this sort of thing to another human being and why. Ultimately, there's an underlying mindset and motivation that drove these policies and initiatives. So this is where I get into discussing a little bit about some of the definition aspect that many of you may have experienced or observed other loved ones experience through the course of your lifetime. And some of us have had the privilege of not having to experience these things. So we're going to be talking about how it's best to conceptualize the driving force behind these harmful policies, examining human behavior first through the individual character. And so next, through the lens of those who are in influence of power, authority, and control. And then we have these listed below, these topics: entitlement and individualistic mindset versus selfishness, victim stance, cognitive distortion, and victim blaming. Next slide. And so with victim blaming, this is something that people who identify with an aggressive mindset will do. They're very successful at leaning into any of their experience as victims themselves throughout the course of their history, and so they're believable and they're convincing that when they are able to sell that they are the victim to other people. So they're able to garner empathy and support for their mission and cause, and then they will blame their victims. And sometimes we can see this in daily life, at work or at home even. And then the entitlement mentality. This is where people believe that they're entitled to more than they actually are. They don't feel like they have to work for something or do something themselves in any sort of way. They just feel like you should hand over whatever they want on a silver platter. And so with that being said, understanding some of these concepts, we go into some of the broader concepts of how these manifest and interact with potential leadership and authority. And so we look at what is paternalism. And paternalism is an infringement, an ideology that infringes on personal freedoms and autonomy of others, and it involves competing claims between individual liberty and authoritative control. And some of the questions to consider when we look into how societies have become paternalistic throughout history is to ask, is it justifiable to limit freedom and autonomy in a society where everyone is meant to be treated as equal and deserves respect? In a society of equal, people are capable of understanding the public good and willing to modify their behavior accordingly. And I think we saw some of this throughout the pandemic. Paternalism undermines some of these concepts by not recognizing people's ability to make informed decisions for themselves. So as a result, any moral defense of paternalism has to provide strong justification for restricting individual freedoms. And so when I say we looked at this more closely in the pandemic, there's a lot of people who got very upset about feeling like they were forced to wear masks or being forced to take a vaccination. To these groups of people, they may have started scenes in local grocery stores. They were very upset. They felt like their autonomy and individual freedoms and liberties were infringed upon. And so maybe for the first time in their entire lives, they were exposed to some of these mindsets and attitudes. They didn't know what to do with themselves. Next slide. And so I'm going to touch a little bit on colonialism. This is something I've heard from academics on LinkedIn. I didn't really fully understand what it meant in my mind at the time. It was, oh, well, you know, when you establish a colony, this is what people are. But what I did not understand is there's a whole mindset behind a colonialism and a colonialist. And in order to be a successful colonist, it requires drive, determination, motivation, focus, and other beliefs and values. And so it is possible that someone who's colonizing a territory may have a sense of superiority or entitlement or the perceived right to dominate and impose one's own values and practices on other people, driven by also a sense of duty to influence development to perceived inferior societies. And so when I was able to understand colonialism through this lens, it became a little more understandable to me. And so we see here that there are adverse impacts of colonialization on underrepresented women and minorities. It is well documented, and it has happened worldwide for centuries. Colonialism consequences on indigenous people. So the research is pretty clear on this. There are several things that I've found in the research that speak to people learning how to internalize racism and experiencing acculturation or cultural erasure entirely. There are impacts on ethnic and racial identity and intergenerational trauma and the profound psychological scars on other people and families and how this gets passed down when we are not fully healed ourselves, and some of those behaviors manifest in our families. And some people experience substance use issues, and a lot more people experience disconnection and alienation, particularly in indigenous people. Next slide. And so this begs us to ask, what is racism? Some people were subjected to it over their lives consistently, and they know very well what it means. They know what it feels like. Some people who aren't subjected to that might need to better understand a definition of what these things look like. So having bias means that, maybe we favor another group or another person And as a result of favoring that group or other person, then we may restrict opportunities for another. Discrimination is the behavioral manifestation of prejudice that involves the hostile treatment of other people, of other groups. And racism is a form of prejudice, including negative emotional reactions to those members of the othered group, and acceptance of those negative stereotypes, and racial discrimination against people can lead to violence. And racist attitudes enable the individual who has power and control to justify their exploitation, oppression, and dehumanization of others based on the belief that the other groups of people or their practices are inferior or inhumane. And then the notion becomes, well, these people shouldn't be having too many children. And we know what's best for these Greenlandic women, so we have to save them. And unfortunately, this can lead to assimilation or even cultural and ethnic cleansing. Next slide. And so we get into exploitation and prejudice here. Exploitation of human and natural resources occurs for the entity, the benefit of the entity in power and control, and because of bias or favorable treatment of those in control and what they have for preferred populations. And exploitation can occur under the guise of development and modernization efforts. And this is paralleled globally in other developing nations with development-driven eugenics and family planning programs, particularly in marginalized communities. And so the eugenics movement, this is something I also had to better understand myself, this is based on incorrect and prejudiced understanding of the work of Charles Darwin and Gregor Mendel to support the idea of racial improvement. In their quest for a perfect society, they labeled many people as unfit, including any ethnic or religious minorities, people with disabilities, and the urban poor. Next slide. Crimes against humanity. That's what this boils down to. Medical and governmental overreach has been a consistent problem throughout history, and what happened to these women and girls is not isolated. And so we see here, the Geneva Conventions described forced sterilization as genocide and a crime against humanity. And the United States was an international leader in eugenics. The Third Reich's 1933 law for prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases was modeled on laws in Indiana and California. That's something I did not learn in history class in high school. And as a result, 400,000 children and adults, mostly Jewish women and children and other undesirables were labeled defective. There were over 60,000 people who were also sterilized in 32 states during the 20th century based on eugenics, with state-sanctioned sterilization peaking in the 30s and 40s. Next slide. So globally, this has happened to Romani women. They were forced sterilized in the Czech Republic as recently as 2007. And the Uyghurs, a religious and racial minority, were also mass sterilized in China. Australia saw this as well. Over 1,000 women and girls and those with disabilities, including the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women with disabilities. Next slide. A little bit closer to home. 300,000 Peruvian women and men were forced sterilized without their informed consent as a part of a government family program in the late 90s. Something I also didn't know about until I started researching this topic. They were lied to, coerced, and in some cases forced physically, and often in unhygienic conditions and lacking aftercare entirely. 17 people died because of improper sterilizations and suffered serious complications, including heart failure and limb paralysis. And Peru's Ministry of Health has never acknowledged these human rights atrocities in their family planning program. Also, in Canada, the Indigenous women and girls over the past 70 years were coercively sterilized with eugenics legislation that were deemed inferior, and in America, Native American women were subjected to forced sterilizations through the 70s until new regulations were adopting requiring informed consent. Next slide, please. So, is it happening in our backyard? No, not our backyard. No. It is. 1,400 incarcerated women in California between 1997 and 2010 experienced forced sterilization. 10 Mexican American women had a lawsuit in LA County, USC Medical Center for involuntary forced sterilizations. One woman said that she was pressured into signing a sterilization consent form during labor. And she also was not counseled on the consequences of this. And this landmark case informed consent practices. Another landmark case, Rell versus Weinberger. Mary and Minnie, their mother, was not able to read or write. She signed an X on a piece of paper, stating that she understood her daughters would receive contraception shots, but instead they were surgically sterilized and robbed of their right to start families. And the Southern Poverty Law Center filed suit on behalf of the Ruff sisters, which exposed widespread sterilization abuse funded by the federal government and practiced for decades. That said, 150,000 people, poor people particularly, were estimated to have been sterilized under federally funded programs. And doctors threatened to terminate welfare benefits unless they consented to procedures, so that many families were under duress. And this case informed the informed consent practices we have today as well. Next slide. So rationale being, the rationale for what happened to the Greenlandic women was financial. They're saving money, and this is a solution for rapid population growth. However, the reality is that the COIL campaign was being investigated as a genocide, and the Human Rights Council, I cannot say her name, I do apologize, she said that they don't want a whitewashed report, so they do believe that they want to get objective data here. Next slide. So who are the women in Greenland who are speaking truth to power? We've got Nye Leiberth. She was one of the first to come out with her story, and she said this happened to her when she was 13 years old. She was told to go to the hospital, and she was at school, and she didn't know what was happening to her. She did not give her permission. She wasn't near her parents, so they didn't give permission either. And she was scared. And she said at the time she didn't even kiss a boy. She didn't know what was happening to her. Other students were talking about this quietly, but no one wanted to say anything out loud because it was just too shocking. Next slide. And then we got our name Black, Polson. She was fitted at the age of 16. She was at boarding school. She and her parents were not informed or asked about this. She was only allowed to travel home once per year. That's how she knows her mom did not know, because this did not happen at home. And she had the coil removed when she came back home a year later. She was experiencing pain. And she said, how would people react when a Danish woman instead of Greenlandic woman experience this? She didn't get a choice. Next slide. We've got Katrina Jacobson. She was fitted at age 12. She said a relative took her to the doctor, and she had the coil in for almost 2 decades. She had pain and many complications before her uterus was removed in the 30s, and it affected her entire life. Next slide. And then Henrietta. Henrietta Barthelsen is an activist and psychologist. She was separated from her family at 11 and fitted a total of 9 times since age 13 per her medical records. She said her parents never consented, and nor did she. She had pain. Her IUDs continued falling out, and she was sent to Denmark a year later to learn Danish. And there was a sign at the school indicated that boarding school girls had to go to the infirmary, and that's how she was introduced to this procedure. And she also remained silent. She said, it simply takes time for marginalized communities to develop an awareness of systemic inequality and the ability to articulate it as a problem, and I found that really important. Next slide. And we've got Kirstine Bertelsen. She was taken to the hospital, not even told why. She was fitted with an IUD, states that she was in pain, and had 2 failed pregnancies, likely from complications due to the procedures. She said she was able to give birth to a son at age 34. She said last year and this year that she's ready for reconciliation and healing, so she was going to look at these reports when they were giving them live. Next slide. So the apology. The Danish Prime Minister apologized formally. She said there's only really one thing to say. Sorry for the wrong that was done to you because you were Greenlanders. Sorry for what was taken from you and from the pain that this caused. Denmark intends to pay reparations to the victims and to any other Greenlanders who were subjected to failure and systemic discrimination. And many women were subjected to systemic discrimination simply because they are Greenlanders. That is a quote from the Prime Minister. So they recognize this formally. And shortly after the decision, the appeals board announced that they were reversing a decision to separate a Greenlandic mother from her newborn daughter only an hour after she was born, because the mother took one of those parenting competency tests, which have been criticized as being racist. Next slide. So lessons learned, bodily autonomy is a human right. This is really where it all comes together. The right to make decisions of our own life and our future is the entire foundation upon which other human rights are built. It is important to be empowered to make informed choices. And we've got different programs and resources here that speak to these very topics. And in the UN level, and they clarify at the UN PFA that autonomy does not give anyone the right to violate bodily integrity or autonomy of anyone else or impose choices onto others. For instance, individuals have the right to choose to have intimate relations or get pregnant, but they are not entitled to impose these choices onto others. Next slide. So informed consent and self-determination. A conversation between a patient and provider about treatment and risks and benefits, and this is required by law and medical code of ethics. This is informed consent. Exceptions to informed consent occur in situations when care is immediately needed, but a patient is unable to advocate for themselves and articulate what they want. And this is when other situations arise where you try to incorporate for minors, a legal guardian, parent, or surrogate to make healthcare decisions for them. And informed consent functions with the right to self-determination in mind. Self-determination denotes the legal rights of people to decide their own destiny in international order. So it is a core principle of international law protected by the UN Charter and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights as a right of all peoples. Next slide. So medical and mental health communities actually have this embedded code of ethics for patient care providers. And they primarily speak to providing informed consent to third-party payers, cost alternatives, and right to refuse or withdraw consent. So you're allowed to consent and then change your mind as well. The American Psychological Association spells it out as well. And so does the American Medical Association Principles of Medical Ethics. So there's the rights of patients and safeguarding privacy within the constraints of the law. Next slide. And we have several notable cases here that speak to the intersection of freedom and public health exceptions, particularly religious, medical, or philosophical. Jacobson versus Massachusetts said that public health officials can require vaccination against smallpox. And Washington versus Harper states that the state is authorized to treat prison inmates against their will with antipsychotics if they're dangerous to themselves or others, and treatment is in best medical interests. And then we've got other cases that speak to the reason why it's important to look at getting our legal affairs in order with before an emergency situation arises. So you can take a look at that slide there. Next slide. And then I inserted the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which also speaks to the right to refuse medical treatment and substantive due process. Next slide. So, multi-systemic recommendations. The Australian Women with Disabilities community recommends official apologies, legal and policy reform, compensation to victims, and recovery and rehabilitation programs. Something interesting to note, the University of Bristol has the Quit Poop Project, and this is a way for people who don't have internet access to be able to call in a toll-free number and share their story, which is recorded and put on an interactive online documentary which explains historical and political context and allows its users to listen to other recorded testimonies. And this project actually facilitated the organization of Indigenous women and supported public visibility of other local women leaders. Next slide. Other recommendations. The Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality with the University of Colorado School of Medicine developed a shared approach for providers. And the Women's Association of Canada developed a sexual and reproductive health toolkit, particularly knowing your rights and informed consent. And the UNPFA has a helpful article about the myths that undermine individual rights and freedoms, particularly related to bodily autonomy, that is very informative. Finally, I think that the most important thing to include here is that this doesn't and didn't happen to only women. It happened to men too in Peru. Men can also be subjected to violations of bodily autonomy, including through invasive and non-consensual medical exams, rape, and coercion. So this does happen to men too. This is not only a women's rights issue, this is for everybody. Bodily autonomy is for every single human being, and it's about individual human beings' whole self, their goals and potential.